So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Grace and peace. How can a loving God allow so much suffering? Where is this loving God when people are suffering? Where is God when you are suffering? We're in a series called When God Doesn't Make Sense, and we're wrestling with the questions that we all wrestle with. Why, God? How, God? Where are you, God? Because the problem of evil is something that we all deal with. And last week we kicked off this series with part 1 of 5. And so let me review real quick if you weren't here, because all 5 parts are needed to understand how to answer this question of evil. For most of us, we've been influenced by a theologian named John Calvin, who basically said that everything happens for a reason. So when someone dies, or when someone's ill, or there's a war or evil, it happens because God somehow has ordained that. Now, John Wesley, another theologian, says, no, the problem of evil is because God has given us the gift of free will, and we can partner with him or we can go our own way, and the things that we see in the world are a result of us turning away from God, the result of sin. And so this way that I'm presenting to you in these 5 parts falls under the heading of John Wesley's thought, John Wesley's theology, but it is definitely something maybe new, maybe different than what we've thought before. So last week we shared 2 foundational truths, and it was these simple thoughts. God always loves because God is love. He never stops loving. And the other foundational thought is genuine evil occurs. It occurs. It's everywhere. Would you agree? God always loves and genuine evil occurs. Those are 2 truths that we all know deep in our heart. So the first point that we mentioned last week is this, that God can't prevent evil single-handedly. God can't prevent evil single-handedly. And I know many of you appreciated that thought because for a lot of us, we've kind of fallen under the thought pattern of John Calvin in which God controls everything and God could stop evil, God could prevent evil if he chooses to. But for many of us, we've realized over time that God can't force himself on anyone because love doesn't force. God's love is uncontrolling. He can't force his love. He can't force someone to do something that they don't want to do. God's love is uncontrolling, and he's given us this free will as a gift. We're not robots. And God chooses to work through the church as his hands and his feet. So he invites us to be participants. So God uses people like us to prevent evil. God uses the policemen, as we talked about the woman from the shooting in Las Vegas. God uses doctors and nurses. God uses us as his hands and his feet. He chooses to do it that way. And God's grace always influences us. So God can't prevent evil single-handedly. Now, part 2 is what we're going to get into today, and it's simply this. And this is the title of the sermon, that God feels our pain. God feels our pain. The question that we're wrestling with really all the way through this series is, who is God? Is God this person up in the sky that is allowing evil to take place, or is God in the midst of the evil trying to stop it? It's a big question. I remember in the middle of my cancer treatment, I went through chemotherapy for 6 months to heal me from lymphoma, and I believe that God was using the doctors and the nurses and the medicine to be part of that. And halfway through my treatment, they did a CAT scan of the chest to see, because my tumors were in the chest, to see if the chemotherapy was working. And I got 2 pieces of bad news from the doctor on that day. Number 1, the tumors were not shrinking. And number 2, that the chemotherapy, one of the 4 drugs that I was taking, it damaged my lungs permanently. 2 pieces of bad news. So I went home from that. It was the winter. I just turned 40 years old. It was the winter. It was dark and it was cold. And I asked the question that many of us ask, why God? And then I asked another question. I said, where are you, God? Where are you, God? Because in that moment, I didn't hear from God. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you've prayed and you prayed and you prayed and you're not getting an answer and you feel like God is not with you. And I imagine God somewhere up in heaven sitting at a throne, on his throne, and pieces of paper were coming through that had each of our names on it, and mine came through, and this judge looked at the piece of paper and it said Paul Dazet cancer. And I imagine in my mind, and this is so crazy, but our images really expose what we think about God. And I imagine God stamping and says, I allow it. And in that time, I know it's crazy. I look back on it and go, that's kind of, not the way God is. But in that moment in time, I felt like, for whatever reason, God was distant from me. And he allowed me to go through this because of his purposes. And I do believe God allows us in certain times to go through suffering for his grand purposes. But I believe that God was absent, that God was distant, and really exposed a kind of false view of God that I held on to. Is that God is a distant God. God is a God that doesn't really care about the details of life. God is distant. And I think many of us go through times of suffering. Our views of God are exposed. What we really believe about God shows up when we go through suffering. And I realized in that dark time of my life that I thought God was distant. He was cold and he was unloving. And so therefore I was being shaped and molded into a disciple who was distant and cold and unloving. But over time, through that season, and as I got into the spring and I continued to treatments, I made a connection in my mind. I said, this God that I'm seeing is distant is the same God that showed up in Jesus. And Jesus was never distant. Jesus was engaging. Jesus touched the leper. Jesus healed people. And I realized during that season of my life that I had an unhealthy view of God. Now, let me ask you, who is God to you? It's typically in our times of suffering that our views of God are exposed or show up. Let me share with you, as we get started, 5 unhealthy views of God that show up when we're suffering. The first one is this. This is the first unhealthy view of God. This is God who is a brick wall. God who is a brick wall. This God does not feel, emphasize, have compassion, console, or involved in our pain. God is distant. It's almost like the Force in Star Wars, an impersonal, uncaring God. This God influences us, but he never really shares in our suffering. The second unhealthy view of God is the eye in the sky. The eye in the sky. If you remember the Bette Midler song about God saying, watching us from a distance. This is the unhealthy view of God that I had when I was going through cancer, that God is distant. Theologians call this view deism, that God is somehow unattached or detached from our world. He is an unblinking eye in the sky. The third unhealthy view is the CEO of the universe. That God is involved in the big pictures, but not involved in the details at all. He's concerned with the global vision, but not at all involved in each of our lives. Then there's the micromanager God, the God who's involved in every little detail, and he's completely controlling, and free will is a mirage. We really don't have any choices. And lastly, the fifth unhealthy view of God is the clean freak. That God is involved in working with people who are clean, but we're not clean. We're scum headed for hell in a handbasket. He doesn't really work with unclean people or sinners. He just works with the holy. And some of these 5 unhealthy views of God, they show up in the midst of our suffering. In other words, when things are good, we don't really think of God that way. We think of God as loving and caring, but when we go through a hard time, these unhealthy views of God show up. Do you relate to any of those? Do you relate to any of those unhealthy views of God? Maybe if you are suffering right now, you might be saying, yeah, when I lay in bed at night, when I think about it, sometimes I feel like me, God's distant. He really doesn't care about Paul Dazet. God maybe is the CEO of the universe or the micromanager. So let's dig into the scriptures today and talk about who is this God and does he feel our pain, which I believe is an incredibly important thing. So if you read the scriptures this week, the intersections, there was this metaphor of seed that ran through them. There was a seed and growth and fruit. It reminds us of the Bloom series and the sunflowers that are growing. And many of your sunflowers, you tell me, are in the ground and they're growing. I'm looking forward to getting pictures. Some of your sunflowers are dead, but whatever, we're going with it. God uses this metaphor to help us understand that we are his growing vessels, that he is growing us, and we just have to be patient. We have to wait, and we have to do the things, but he's the one who grows. We can't force ourselves to grow, right? And so when I put together the intersections of these 4 passages, I came up with this phrase, God's love nurtures us in his new creation, compelling us to love all people. That's the intersection through the 4 passages. Which leads me to say our big idea for today is this. God feels what we feel. God feels what we feel. God is this gardener, is not distant. He engages. He's involved. He's loving these seeds as they grow to plants. He is not disconnected, but he is very connected. And this gardener feels what's going on in his plants. 2 Corinthians 5:14-17 was our text that was read just a few minutes ago, and I was fascinated by the phrase, God's love compels us. God's love compels us. These plants are growing, and because of that, we are recipients of God's grace and his love, and we respond to that love by participating in the healing of the entire world. We don't no longer look at people or look at God from a human point of view. We no longer think of him as a brick wall or an eye in the sky or a CEO in the universe or a micromanager or a clean freak. We now see God through the lens of Jesus. And as we look at Jesus, we see that Jesus is not distant from us. We see that Jesus is not the eye in the sky or the CEO in the universe or the micromanager or the clean freak. He touches the leper. He heals the broken. He's involved in the lives. He's definitely not a brick wall because he cried at the death of Lazarus. He is involved and he cares deeply. And so as I take a look at this God's love compels us, this understanding of that Christ is the revelation of who God is, there's two words that come to mind, and that's empathy and compassion. Empathy and compassion. We watched that video just a few minutes ago about empathy. Let's talk about that a little bit. That God feels your pain. Think about that. If you're suffering today, if you're going through a hard time, that God is empathetic towards you, that God comes down from his high place down into the pit with you. And he's not the person on top of the ladder that looks at you and says, "Do you want a sandwich?" I always find that funny because that's our temptation in church, is to be distantly involved in the lives of people. Someone's going through a hard time, we drop off the casserole, which is great, by the way. Keep dropping off casseroles to people who are hurting. Because when I was going through cancer, that food really blessed us, right? But there is another step, isn't there? It's suffering with, it's being with. And empathy is this idea, which Jesus demonstrated over and over again, is that Jesus came into the pit. He left heaven to earth, and he comes down where we are, and he sheds a tear at the pain that we experience. When Mary and Martha were grieving the loss of Lazarus, Jesus cried. That Jesus is with and feels with and cares for us. He's empathetic with us. And so for people like me who go through these situations in life and I feel like God is distant, Jesus shows us that God is not distant. You with me? We feel that God is distant, but Jesus shows us that God is not distant. God is with us in the midst of the pain. He feels what we feel. Do you think Mary and Martha were crying? Absolutely. They were grieving their brother. Jesus had this full picture of eternity. He understood resurrection. He understood that Lazarus will get a new body one day, just like you and I. But still, Jesus shed a tear. Why? Because Mary and Martha were shedding a tear. In other words, Jesus feels what he feels. Jesus really cares with what you are going through. It's great that God can't stop evil single-handedly, and he involves us. I love that from last week. But that alone still gives us this picture that God is involved but doesn't really care. But understanding that God is involved and he truly cares with what you're going through helps us understand why God is doing what he does, because he loves each one of us. And the second word there is compassion. And do you remember when Jesus was looking out at the people and it says he was moved with compassion because the people were sheep without a shepherd. He looked out at Jerusalem and he was moved with compassion. That understanding that moved with compassion. Compassion is this feeling deep in the gut. It's actually connected with the bowels. It's almost like your stomach is upset. When Jesus was moved with compassion, he had an upset stomach as he was looking at the condition of the people that he created. He was moved with compassion. That word compassion comes from the Latin understanding of suffering with. Suffering with. That's what the word compassion means. And so when Jesus was moved with compassion, he was suffering with his people. He was not distant. He was not absent. He was involved in suffering. He actually felt the pain of his people. And so when we hear things like that, we have to be reminded, does God really feel my pain? God is so personally involved and engaged with us in the midst of our suffering that he actually feels it. He feels the pain. He feels the agony. He suffers with us. And so if you're going through a valley experience, you might not think that God is with you because he's silent, but let me encourage you that he's not absent. He's with you. Compassion. It reminds me of that story of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Do you remember that story? The story of this man was beat up and left on the side of the road. And two religious people walked by the man on the side of the road and did not help. And a Samaritan came by, the third person in this parable. Now, the Jews and the Samaritans don't get along, right? The Jews used to think the Samaritans were dogs. That's what they called them, right? It was really two groups of people, kind of like our political climate, right? These people don't like these people, and these people. So you got two Jews. These are insiders, right? These are people that Jesus is making a point here. These are the people that should have stopped. This is like a pastor and a priest. They should have stopped, right? And they didn't. And there's many reasons maybe why they didn't, They were afraid, There's all of these purity cultures. You can't touch blood, can't touch dead people. There's all of these stuff going on. But the interesting thing about it is this Samaritan, this outsider, stops. And it says he was moved with compassion. I want you to understand, this Samaritan, this outsider, was moved with compassion. And it says he approached the guy who was beat up. In other words, he didn't help from a distance. He didn't drop off a casserole and say, here, get well. He moved in. He moved in. He was moved. He was heartbroken for the man. And he did something. He engaged in helping this man and took him to an inn and paid for, so he got healthy. The interesting thing is that compassion, he engaged. He felt the pain. He felt what that man was going through. And then Jesus at the end of the parable says what? Go and do likewise. Go and be empathetic. Go and be compassionate to the people in our lives. Why? I hear that parable and I hear it as like, okay, Paul, you need to go and help people. But the reason why he says go and do likewise, the reason he says that is because he himself is compassionate. That our God is compassionate. He suffers with us. He feels what we're going through. And so he leaves heaven, just like the Good Samaritan, the outsider comes in. He leaves heaven, comes to earth, takes on human flesh, right? And engages and helps and heals. And so the reason why he says go and do likewise, the point of the parable, is because God, our God, in Jesus Christ, is empathetic and compassionate. And so he says, go and do likewise. So the big idea is that God feels what you feel, what we feel. When we're going through a hard time, when there is a mass shooting and families are grieving a loss, or they're heartbroken, or they're concerned, God suffers with those that are hurting. We talked about last week, God's involved. He never stops, and he feels what these people are going through. So God never stops. He's always loving, always healing, always working, but he's feeling with us. This God is not distant. He comes to us in the midst of our pain and feels what we feel. Is that encouraging to you? Let me ask you, are you suffering right now? What is your view of God? And is it possible that maybe some of our views of God are unhealthy and unbiblical? Because ultimately, Jesus is the complete revelation of who God is. If we want to know who God is and how he deals with suffering, we look at Jesus. Jesus is the picture. When I was going through chemo and I had that faulty view of God, I was looking at incomplete pictures of the Old Testament. I was looking at these little glimpses and little pictures from the Old Testament stories, and they're incomplete. They're like slices of the pie. They're just little tiny pieces, and I was taking my understanding of God from those little tiny glimpses as incomplete. But what I should have been doing, and what we need to do, is we need to look at our understanding of God through the lens of Jesus Christ, because he is the complete, exact, as it says in Hebrews, exact imprint of God. If you want to know who God is, we look to Jesus. And so what did Jesus do when people were suffering? He engaged them. He went with them. He was moved with compassion. He was feeling what they feel. and then he did something about it. So here we are in 2021, just finished a pandemic, and many of us are still reeling from that. Many of us have lost loved ones. Many of us know people who are hurting and sick. Many of us are not doing all that great. There is an epidemic of depression and anxiety. There's people that feel alone. There are people who are discouraged because they feel like God isn't present, that God is absent, that God is distant. May all of us understand that God feels our pain, that God feels what we feel, and may we be encouraged today, because no matter what you're going through, God is with you, and he feels what you feel. I was thinking today as I was going through cancer, and I'll share the good news of how God healed me next week, because we get into part 3. But I was thinking about how did I feel God's love in the midst of that cancer. And in my journals, I jotted down a lot of ways that I experienced God's love. So to kind of wrap up this sermon, let me share with you some of the very practical ways that I was encouraged during the midst of my cancer to experience this love of God, to kind of counteract the distant God. And the first way, and see if we can put these on the screen, the first way, it was through the ministry of human presence. And I wrote in parentheses, therapist. It was in the midst of my cancer that I started seeing a therapist. And I realized that it really wasn't the cancer that I was talking to the therapist about. It was all the other broken things in my life that I was talking to the therapist. And I felt God's presence as I talked to a therapist. Now, I believe this, and you might think I'm crazy, but I believe that every person on this planet needs a therapist. Every person on the planet needs a counselor. I really believe that. Because I don't know about you, but I'm broken, right? And I got stuff in my life that I've never dealt with. From things from my childhood to things in my adult years, mistakes I've made, things that were done to me, right? And those things need to be worked out. And when you talk to a therapist, which I encourage you as you deal with your stuff and your junk, to don't be afraid. There's no shame in talking to a therapist or a counselor at all. In fact, we got a partnership with CCC downtown and their counseling. So if you want to talk to somebody, I'll connect you. But it's through the therapist that you realize your thoughts about God. And it's oftentimes through the therapist that you realize sometimes that some of those thoughts aren't healthy. And so that presence of, the human presence of people in our lives really help us. Now, the second way that I was helped was through the church, through community of care, right? Through community of care. The church, I shared with you before, the church, as I was going through cancer, they loved us in such an amazing way. And one of the weeks that I was out 6 weeks after I had my open heart surgery to get to the tumor and stuff. And one of the weeks, the church people showed up in our front yard and had a picnic. I was moved with the care that they had. They didn't knock on the door, didn't bother us, they just wanted to show us that they cared about us. And so they had a picnic on our front yard. It was one of the coolest things. The church helps us experience God's love. The third is this, prayer and meditation. Prayer and meditation. I had a personal prayer that I prayed throughout the cancer. It was this: your kingdom come, my kingdom go. Your kingdom come, my kingdom go. And that was a personal prayer that I prayed through my season with cancer. And it was helpful. It was really helpful to experience God's presence. The fourth is nature, right? The fourth is nature. Stacy and I a doctor made us, but Stacy and I would go on walks. And something about being outside in a park, something about being surrounded in a flower garden that we used to go and walk through. There was something about being outside. And if you, like me, go to the beach, or you love being at the beach, or you hike in a mountain, or just look at an overlook, or that, we're reminded about God's presence oftentimes when we're in nature. That was the fourth way. Fifth way was through art and music and movies. Art, music, and movies. That God uses art, music, and movies to help us. I pulled out the CD, it was a CD at the time when I was going through it, but now I have the vinyl. This album helped me. U2, The Joshua Tree. In my opinion, the greatest album of all time, right? I don't know what music helps you, but God uses music, doesn't he? God uses music to encourage us. There was one time I was so depressed, and I turned on Journey's Greatest Hits, and Don't Stop Believing came on, and I was just, God uses music. God uses art. Movies. Movies move you. God uses movies. For me, it's The Shack. It's the recent movie, Just Mercy, about racial injustice that moved me. Schindler's List moved me. And as a geek, The Lord of the Rings moved me, right? The Ring of Power. I need to stay away from that ring, right? I mean, there's all of these ways that God uses art, movie, music to encourage us, to show us that he loves us and cares for us. What's number 6? Because I don't remember off the top of my head. The love of a child. Micah was just a little guy when I was going through that. He had no idea his dad was sick, right? He looked at me and I was bald. I mean, he didn't care. And he just would sit in my lap, just love on me. We'd watch Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, right? The love of a child. We experience God's love through the love of a child. And 7, surrender. I experience God's love and his presence and his empathy and compassion when I stop fighting against him. I'm yours, Lord. I know you're loving me. I know you're healing. I know you're working in all ways. I surrender fighting against you. Just have me. Your kingdom come, my kingdom go. Just use me in any way that you want. I don't know how you experience God's love and compassion and empathy, but those are some ways that God spoke to me during my season with cancer. God feels what you're feeling right now. He's not distant. He's empathetic and compassionate. And when we add in what we talked about last week, that God's on the move, he's using the church to bring healing to the world, God never gives up, he's always, always working. Let us be reminded that he's loving us and caring for us. He's compassionate and empathetic for the things that you're going through and the things that the broken world is going through. Our God really cares. Let us pray. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for this message of compassion and empathy. You wrote through the Apostle Paul that your love compels us. May we be compelled by your love today. May we can be compelled by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the gospel message, the good news that death isn't the end of the story, that our sins can be forgiven, that we can be set free, that all things are being made new. May we be encouraged. May we be compelled today by your love to be your hands and feet in the world. But for all those that are hurting today, all those that are struggling today, all those who are down, all those who feel like you're distant, may your love today surround them. May you be with them. May you shed a tear for them. And may you suffer with them. And may we as a church suffer with one another, just as we talked about with the body, one part broken. We all hurt. Be with us. We thank you, Lord. And we pray this in Christ's name. And everybody said, amen.